This story, disturbing and tragic, is a documented case in police files, haunting the community and drawing nationwide attention. It centers around a woman named Laura Jensen, whose actions and ultimate demise sparked horror and outrage. Laura's life took a dark turn upon discovering her HIV diagnosis, a revelation that drove her to an intense, dangerous vendetta. She infected 47 men over several years, driven by a desire for revenge that led to her death under mysterious, violent circumstances. Laura Jensen grew up in a small, close-knit town, where her quiet, watchful nature set her apart from her peers. She was intelligent, with a perceptive eye that often made her seem wise beyond her years. Yet, she was often overlooked. Her life was marked by feelings of invisibility and isolation, even within her family. As she reached adulthood, Laura became determined to escape the confinements of her hometown and reinvent herself in the city. Once she moved, Laura embraced the city's vibrant energy, hoping it would fill the emptiness she'd felt her whole life. She took a job as an office assistant, the sort of role she didn't expect to keep forever, but that suited her independent nature. Over time, she crafted an image of self-sufficiency and allure. Friends were few, but her social skills and striking looks allowed her to slip in and out of social circles, remaining both familiar and mysterious. Beneath the surface, however, Laura carried a growing resentment, stemming from her unfulfilled longing for genuine connection and validation. In her relationships, Laura was selective but never fully invested, cycling through brief affairs and occasional longer flings. Many men were captivated by her elusive charm, yet none could reach the guarded parts of her soul. Repeated heartbreaks and casual betrayals left her feeling bitter. She began to associate romance with loss and vulnerability, things she was determined to avoid. Despite her outer confidence, her experiences reinforced a deep-seated distrust of others, particularly men, who often seemed to exploit her trust and abandon her. Laura's life took an irreversible turn one early winter morning when she visited a health clinic. She had been feeling unusually tired and had experienced persistent symptoms that had lingered for weeks. She had initially dismissed these signs as stress from her demanding schedule and late nights, but when the symptoms worsened, she decided to go in for a checkup. After a series of routine tests, her doctor requested additional blood work. Days later, she received a call asking her to come back in. The doctor's tone was measured but gave little away. Laura arrived to find herself led to a small, sterile consultation room, where the doctor met her with a solemn expression. He began by explaining her recent blood test results, leading her through a slow build-up that seemed to stretch time itself. When he finally delivered the words, "You've tested positive for HIV," her mind went blank. The shock was immediate. As the doctor explained the details of her condition, Laura's thoughts raced, struggling to process the enormity of the diagnosis. The words he spoke felt unreal: antiretroviral treatments, viral load management, regular blood tests, long-term health planning. He reassured her that HIV was no longer a death sentence, but to Laura, the diagnosis felt like a final, devastating condemnation. Her life, which had felt under control only moments ago, was now irrevocably marked. As Laura left the clinic, her emotions rapidly shifted from numb disbelief to rage. She couldn't shake the thought of how she'd contracted the virus, replaying every relationship, every intimacy, wondering who had left her with this. The thought of betrayal sank deep. As she went through past names and faces, she was flooded with memories of times she had opened herself up, only to be let down, discarded, or ignored. The diagnosis felt like proof of what she had always feared, that she had been carelessly used and discarded. Her sense of isolation grew. She didn't reach out to friends or family for support, certain they wouldn't understand. Instead, the feelings of anger and betrayal settled like a heavy weight, turning her grief into something darker. The more she thought about it, the more her bitterness and fury grew. She saw her diagnosis not just as a personal tragedy but as the result of a world that had failed her. From that point on, Laura felt transformed. Instead of despair, a deep and twisted resolve took root in her. She would no longer be the one suffering alone, others would feel the burden she now bore. In the weeks following her diagnosis, Laura's rage crystallized into a dangerous resolve. Her grief and isolation turned into a reckless vendetta as she made a chilling decision: she would share her pain with the world, starting with the men who crossed her path. She saw her own infection not as an isolated tragedy but as an outcome of betrayal, and it fueled a twisted sense of justice in her. Each encounter would become, in her mind, a form of retribution. At first, Laura resumed her usual social routines, blending into her old world as if nothing had changed. She went out to clubs and parties, but now, her presence carried a darker purpose. Her manner became enticing yet coldly calculated, her charm refined to attract the attention she needed. Men were drawn to her allure, unaware of the danger that lay beneath her flirtations. Laura's methods were deliberate. She chose men with particular care, opting for those she perceived as careless or dismissive, traits that now stoked her resentment. It didn't take much: a few shared drinks, a casual compliment, and she had their interest. Her charm and sophistication masked any bitterness or anger. They found her exciting, mysterious, and she allowed them to see only what she wanted them to. To maintain secrecy, Laura rarely let anyone get too close. She gave fake names, kept meetings brief, and refused to exchange personal details. In intimate moments, she dismissed questions about protection, skillfully brushing aside any concerns and quickly shifting the mood if anyone hesitated. Her determination to remain undetected was unshakable, and she operated with an eerie efficiency, keeping her true motives hidden. As the months went on, Laura's encounters grew frequent, and her sense of control over her plan intensified. She began keeping a mental tally of those she'd infected, a disturbing ritual that further fueled her feelings of power. The anonymity of these encounters suited her, allowing her to slip back into the night without attachments. In her mind, each new victim was a small act of retribution, a way to even the score against a world that had left her scarred. But as her vendetta unfolded, Laura began to feel something beyond anger. Beneath the satisfaction of revenge, there was a gnawing void, a hollowness that her acts couldn't fill. The fleeting sense of control was shadowed by isolation and guilt, a persistent reminder of the life she once had and the innocence she'd lost. Still, she pushed these feelings aside, too far gone to reconsider, choosing to move forward with even greater resolve. As her reckless vendetta continued, rumors began to surface. Friends and acquaintances of her past lovers began to speak of unusual illness spreading among them, stories hinting at a common thread. But Laura dismissed the risks, certain her plan was beyond discovery. Unbeknownst to her, however, the reckless nature of her actions was edging closer to exposure and, eventually, tragedy. Her vengeful path was setting into motion a series of consequences that neither she nor her victims could anticipate. Laura met James in one of the more upscale bars she'd begun frequenting. He was different from the others, slightly older, with a composed, confident presence. A man who carried himself with an air of control, James was well-dressed, attentive, and charmingly cautious. For Laura, he presented an intriguing challenge, a departure from her usual targets. She found herself drawn to his sophistication and charisma, even as she reminded herself of her purpose. Their initial conversation was easy, lively, and refreshingly devoid of the usual game-playing she'd come to expect. James was perceptive, asking questions about her background and carefully observing her responses. His attention thrilled her, yet it stirred an unexpected tension. This was someone who seemed to understand people deeply, who perhaps even saw the sadness in her eyes she worked so hard to mask. But Laura couldn't let herself get too close. After all, she was carrying out a plan she'd promised herself she wouldn't abandon. Their connection quickly deepened, with their casual meetings leading to something closer to an affair. They met regularly over the next few weeks, sharing long conversations and intimate evenings. For a time, Laura felt a flicker of the excitement and connection she'd lost after her diagnosis. James's attentive presence began to chip away at the emptiness she'd carried for so long, and though she tried to ignore it, she felt drawn to him beyond her original intentions. One morning, months after their last meeting, James woke with unusual symptoms. At first, he brushed them off, blaming stress or fatigue, but as weeks passed, the symptoms persisted and grew worse. Concerned, he finally visited his doctor, who recommended a full examination and blood work. Days later, the results confirmed his worst fear: James had contracted HIV. The news stunned him. His life, meticulously managed and predictable, was suddenly thrown into chaos. In a haze of disbelief and anger, he began to think back to every recent encounter, every potential risk. Yet one name stood out above the others: Laura. He hadn't seen her in weeks, hadn't even heard from her. The realization dawned on him slowly, and then with brutal clarity: Laura, the charming woman he'd allowed himself to trust, might have been the one who infected him. Fueled by anger and a growing obsession to confront her, James began searching for her. The traces she left were faint. She'd never shared much about her life, her address, or even her real name. But James was persistent. Through mutual acquaintances and a few contacts at the bars where they'd met, he finally tracked her down, piecing together enough details to locate her apartment. It was late one evening when James arrived at her doorstep, his face contorted with rage and desperation. Laura opened the door, and the shock on her face turned to a calm acceptance as she saw him. She knew instantly why he had come, but she tried to keep her composure, bracing herself for the confrontation. James's voice was low, almost trembling with anger, as he demanded answers. He wanted her to admit the truth, to acknowledge the deception she'd hidden behind for so long. But Laura, fueled by her own bitterness, met his accusations with a chilling indifference, dismissing his words as though they meant nothing. James's anger swelled as Laura's coldness deepened. He felt the betrayal, the humiliation, the despair she had inflicted on him. Without warning, he lunged forward, pushing her backward into the apartment. Laura staggered, momentarily off balance, but she quickly attempted to regain control of the situation, refusing to show any fear. She tried to walk away, brushing him off with callous disregard, but James's fury had reached a breaking point. In a surge of rage, he reached for a heavy object on her kitchen counter. To the flower vase, his grip tightened around it as he advanced on her, his vision clouded by anger and anguish. Laura barely had time to turn before he swung, the weight striking her with brutal force across her temple. She stumbled, a shocked expression on her face as she tried to steady herself, but James's rage was unrelenting. He struck her again, each blow echoing with his pain and betrayal. The apartment fell silent, and Laura collapsed, her body still as the realization of his actions settled over him. James stood frozen, staring at her lifeless form, his breathing ragged as the weight of his crime slowly sank in. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't come with the intention to kill, but in his blind rage, he had ended her life. The silence of the room was deafening, the finality of his actions an anchor he couldn't escape. The following morning, a neighbor noticed the door to Laura's apartment slightly ajar, an unusual sight given her habit of keeping to herself. Suspicious and sensing something was wrong, they cautiously peered inside and spotted her lifeless body on the floor. Within minutes, local authorities were called, and the scene quickly became a hub of activity. Police cordoned off the area, forensic specialists meticulously catalogued every detail, and detectives moved through the apartment, absorbing the grim evidence left behind. Detectives Maria Ortega and Simon Hayes were assigned to the case. Ortega, a seasoned investigator with a sharp intuition, took immediate note of the apartment's sparse decor and traces of an unsettled life, piles of medical paperwork, a few personal effects, and a minimal wardrobe. Everything seemed as though it had been hastily put together, signaling a person who had likely been on the move or hiding something. Hayes, younger but with a keen analytical mind, methodically combed through the scene, noting the signs of struggle and anger embedded in every blow that had struck Laura down. Forensics confirmed that Laura had died from repeated blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon, a marble paperweight, was found lying beside her, its smooth surface stained. Fingerprints covered its handle, which became a vital piece of evidence as investigators began building their case. During initial inquiries, Laura's background quickly came into focus. Investigators discovered a history marked by instability, loss, and anger. Interviews with neighbors and former acquaintances painted a picture of a woman who was distant, elusive, and who rarely shared details of her personal life. But as detectives dug deeper, a startling revelation came to light. Laura had been diagnosed with HIV years prior, a fact hidden from many who knew her. Upon uncovering this diagnosis, Ortega and Hayes began piecing together Laura's recent social connections, noticing a pattern of transient relationships. With persistence, they reached out to medical facilities, confirming that Laura had, indeed, knowingly engaged in unprotected relationships without disclosing her illness. This detail transformed the investigation, making the motive behind her death more complex. They now suspected that Laura's death might not have been a random act but a deliberate response to the pain she had inflicted. The detectives' next step was identifying those connected to her in the weeks leading up to her death. Their interviews led them to men who recalled brief, passionate affairs with Laura, some of whom admitted to contracting HIV after meeting her. Each man had his story, his regrets, and his suspicions, and each one added a piece to the tragic puzzle. Through this list of contacts, one name came up repeatedly: James Lowell. A successful businessman with no prior criminal record, James seemed an unlikely suspect, but his recent interactions with Laura and the timing of her death drew Ortega's attention. In one interview, a mutual friend mentioned that James had recently received life-changing news about his health. Following this lead, Ortega and Hayes traced James to his last known address. When they brought him in for questioning, James appeared visibly tense. As Ortega observed his behavior, she noticed subtle signs: the way his gaze avoided direct contact, the slight tremor in his hands. Hayes began with basic questions, but as they delved into his relationship with Laura, James's composure faltered. He admitted to knowing about his diagnosis, and while he tried to control his responses, his anger and frustration began to seep through his words. Finally, when Ortega pressed him directly about the night of Laura's death, James hesitated. Detectives noticed his body language shift as he clenched his hands, a sign of inner turmoil. Hayes decided to confront him with evidence: the fingerprints on the marble paperweight. James's face drained of color, and he realized the gravity of the evidence stacked against him. Caught between anger and despair, James finally confessed. He described the betrayal, the feeling of devastation upon discovering that Laura had knowingly infected him and likely others. In a voice choked with bitterness, he recounted how he had confronted her that night, demanding answers, only to be met with indifference and hostility. He hadn't intended to kill her, he said, but the confrontation had escalated beyond his control. As James's confession ended, Ortega and Hayes exchanged a glance, each understanding the tragic layers of the case before them. While justice would be served for Laura's murder, her story left a legacy of pain and consequences that extended beyond the immediate crime. The arrest brought closure to her death, but the impact of her actions and the lives affected by her choices left a shadow the detectives couldn't ignore. In the end, they realized that this case was more than a single crime. It was a cautionary tale about choices, consequences, and the devastating paths that pain could lead people down. James Foster became the prime suspect after detectives found that he had visited her apartment on the night of her death. Cell phone records placed him in the area, and further investigation revealed he had been actively looking for others she had infected. When questioned, James initially denied involvement but later admitted he had been there that night, enraged and demanding answers. Under pressure, James confessed to a heated confrontation with Laura, detailing how their argument escalated. Overcome with anger, he lashed out. James admitted to using brute force during the attack, unable to control his fury. His confession provided the final piece of evidence that law enforcement needed to close the case. The revelation of Laura's actions shocked her community and led to numerous public discussions around consent, health, and the ethics of revenge. In the aftermath, health authorities reached out to warn others who might have encountered her, urging testing and treatment. Meanwhile, James Foster faced trial, his defense complicated by the evidence of Laura's actions. This tragic series of events became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked anger and resentment. For those affected by Laura's choices, her death brought a sense of closure, but it came at a high cost, leaving a dark legacy and forever altering the lives of those